Hi everyone, it's your old anatomy professor Becky here, and today we are going to review fluid and electrolyte balance. Now some of this you'll recall super straightforward, other parts can be pretty complicated. So let's take a look at what we learned in anatomy class. So we talked about fluid balance, basically that your ins need to equal your outs in order to have balance. You'll recall that most of your fluids come through liquid intake, a good portion comes through food, and then there's also this small portion that is a result of what's called metabolic water. Think for a moment. Do you remember what that is? Where does that come from? If you said cellular respiration, you're correct. So this is the byproduct of cellular respiration, and it's part of the intake. Urine, loss from the skin, both insensible and sensible, like sweat, the lungs, and then also a little bit of water is lost in feces, right? So that's some of the stuff where you're like, oh yeah, I remember that, super straightforward. We know that those fluids are super important. They dissolve and transport substances like all your nutrients, oxygen, the hormones in your body, right? And so this is a huge portion, obviously, of your blood volume, the plasma. Blood volume leads to blood pressure, which allows your organs to be perfused. So if you lose too much fluid, if you get dehydrated, you can actually go into shock. It helps maintain body temperature. It prevents big swings in body temperature. And then, of course, protecting and lubricating tissues. Now, the electrolyte side of things, when we think about their function, a lot of times we think about, okay, yeah, that's right. When we send an action potential, we needed sodium, we needed potassium. And so we think about things like the nervous system or how the muscles work. Remember the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the muscle storing all that calcium that was necessary for muscle contraction, right? So those would be electrolytes. But one of the things that we're going to see is that, right, these are in the same chapter, fluids and electrolytes are so tightly tied because, remember, you never actively move water. You can move electrolytes, you can move salts, and water follows them. Okay, then we start getting into the nitty gritty. Cations, positively charged electrolytes. Extracellular fluids outside of the cell, we have primarily sodium. Intracellular fluid, recall, is dominated by potassium. As far as the anions or the negative ions go, outside of the cell, it's chloride. Inside of the cell, it's a lot of things like phosphate and also anionic proteins. Okay, and again, where these electrolytes are, where these ions are, is going to determine where the fluids in your body are. So, a lot of you, I remember, really didn't like this part. So, as a quick review, as blood is coming into these capillary beds are the only part that's permeable enough for water to move in and out. But what we'll see is that we have certain forces, things like blood hydrostatic pressure, that's capillary hydrostatic pressure, overcoming blood colloid osmotic pressure. Remember the salts or the proteins in the blood that holds things into the capillaries. If the blood pressure overpowers that drawing in of things like the solutes, then we're actually going to push fluids out of the blood supply, and vice versa as well. If the colloids inside of the blood, salts, protein cells, can draw water in over the action of that hydrostatic pressure, you'll actually pull fluids into the blood vessels. This is a really important concept if you're still struggling with this idea of why fluids would stay inside a blood vessel or return to a blood vessel versus leaving. Let's go over this. Okay. We see that in the normal body, about 2/3 of your fluids are actually inside of the cell, and about 1/3 is extracellular fluid. If you start sweating, hemorrhaging, you're getting dehydrated, and that extracellular fluid volume drops, notice the electrolytes don't change. There's the same number in there, and so it becomes more concentrated. That's going to trigger osmosis, and the water is going to flow from the inside of the cell, outside of the cell. Okay, again, this idea of osmosis and different chambers in the body is going to be important. Okay, so then we get into the real nitty-gritty. So I'm not gonna hammer this too much, but what you need to recall when we think about fluid and electrolyte balance is that there's actually a few hormones that play super important roles here. Okay, aldosterone, right? It makes you retain sodium, the kidney, and excrete potassium. So there's two electrolytes, right? Aldosterone. Antidiuretic hormone, this is going to determine how many water channels are in the kidney. So more antidiuretic hormone is going to help you reabsorb more water so you don't pee. Natriuretic peptides, the atrial natriuretic peptide, the brain natriuretic peptide. Those hormones actually oppose ADH and aldosterone and try to get you to lose fluids. Who's the other one? Oh, parathyroid hormone. Remember, parathyroid hormone is going to help you increase blood calcium levels, while calcitonin has you decrease blood calcitonin levels. So there's other hormones involved, but those are the main ones, right? And so this is just an image from your anatomy book looking at how homeostasis of sodium concentrations takes place. Now notice we're always looking at the extracellular fluid. So if we're getting increased levels of sodium, we're going to have stimulation in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is always checking plasma levels, cerebrospinal fluid levels, and we're going to secrete antidiuretic hormone to try to get us to pee off less water and actually dilute that sodium back to homeostasis, right? But if there's not enough salt, we're actually going to drop the levels of antidiuretic hormone. We're going to work to lose some more water. And again, we restore homeostasis. When we look at what happens as far as fluid volume goes, it's related to the electrolytes again, right? So if we have an increased volume, so our blood pressure is, say, getting too high, fluid gain, often this is related to sodium gain, right? So as the blood volume and the blood pressure increases, that's going to cause us to release some of these natriuretic peptides as the heart gets overstretched, right? This comes from cardiac cells. And these natriuretic peptides, again, tell us to lose sodium in the urine, lose water in the urine, right? And they kind of counteract antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, that sort of thing. So through this, we start peeing out lots of water, lots of sodium. We reduce the blood volume, the blood pressure, boom, back to homeostasis. The opposite direction, right? So if we're starting to get dehydrated, we're losing fluid volume, losing sodium. We decrease the blood volume and therefore the blood pressure. And here's your favorite. Oh, I didn't mention this in the hormones. Remember RAS, the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So it ends with aldosterone release, which is going to tell us to reabsorb sodium at the kidney. We also get antidiuretic hormone release, telling us to hold on to water at the kidney. And both of these things, as well as increased thirst, is going to bring that blood volume, blood pressure back up. Okay. And again, as I'm saying this, you're like, wait a second, she's talking about the kidney. Remember, antidiuretic hormone and also aldosterone, they work on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct of the kidney. Is that sounding familiar? Right, so the kidney obviously plays a big role in fluid and electrolyte balance. And I pulled this one up just to remind you, again, parathyroid hormone increases calcium levels in the bloodstream, does that in 3 places. It's removing calcium from the bone. It's telling you to absorb calcium at the small intestine and telling you not to pee that calcium out. Calcitonin does the opposite. It actually helps you pack the calcium into the bone, ignore the calcium that's going through the small intestine, and tells the kidney to go ahead and pee this out. So when you look at fluid and electrolytes, they're very much tied together. We get some really complex but important homeostatic processes. So make sure you spend a little time making sure that you really understand how this works so you can think through it, right? This is one where memorization is going to be tough, other than a few key maybe terms or what a certain hormone does, but you really have to understand this whole concept, and you're going to see this in a lot of different diseases, and it's going to be super important in things like shock. So make sure you get this one down. Okay, we'll catch you next time.